Cases against one district's Board of Education can now move forward after a decision from the state Supreme Court. The court recently upheld the Safe Child Act, which gives adults a 2-year window to bring civil actions against their childhood abusers. This paves the way for adults to proceed in their cases against the new Hanover County Board of Education related to Peter Frank. Frank was a band teacher at Roland Grice Middle School who was sentenced to 50 years in prison on more than a dozen counts of sex crimes against children. In a statement, a lawyer who helps represent some of Frank's victims said about the decision, quote, "We were so pleased and honestly relieved for all survivors of childhood sexual abuse that the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the constitutionality of the Safe Child Act this week." Ryan Law Firm represents 3 women who were abused by a former band teacher who is now in prison for his actions. But without the Safe Child Act, the statute of limitations would have prevented them pursuing civil actions against Peter Frank and the new Hanover County schools. Now that the act has been found constitutional, their lawsuit can proceed and they can seek justice on the civil side for what they experienced, end quote.